Hey guys, it's been a little while. So, I'm sorry I've kind of disappeared a little bit. I haven't streamed in like a week, and this was in preparation for the Twitch Rivals event, which I'm recording this pretty much right after it finished, but I guess it'll be yesterday for you guys. And basically the last 7 days I've been like hardcore grinding and prepping, coming up with like kind of the perfect lineup for this event. Spoiler alert, I ended up placing number 1 for the seed, so effectively like winning the event, although we don't have the highest points because of like how the other seeds ended up going. But we did take first place, which is quite nice. Now, I want to actually kind of like in this video break down a lot about kind of like the lineup we ended up going with and why we chose the cards we did. So this is going to be a really good video to watch if you're interested in like ever playing in tournaments, because there's so much more to constructing a tournament lineup than just like ladder decks. It's a completely different process. Also, it's important to mention that this tournament was won in the deck builder. I did probably not, I don't think I played the best out of everyone in the tournament. I made a couple of like kind of floppy misplays, not great stuff. I played clean, I played all right. But I won because I had the best lineup, and this is this lineup. This lineup that I prepared for these last 7 days for is what won the tournament. So at this point, I'd like to give I guess like a shout out to my prep group here. I actually assembled like 7 different friends together. These are all like really smart card game players that some of them, well, I guess all of them actually I ended up meeting in Runeterra. And I really couldn't have done this without them. We basically grinded a ton of hours together, running like matchup matrices, running tests, like, you know, doing deck techs and tweaks, and theory crafting in general. These 7 folks are Precipic, Fresh Lobster, G'day Maverick, Nick Makes Plays, Presto, Rattling Bones, and Silverfuse. In all likelihood, you've heard like at least 1 or 2 of those names before, because most of these guys have like streams and some have like YouTube channels that I'm actually going to be linking in the pinned comment for you guys to check out. These guys are all actually like really smart at the game, and you should absolutely check out their stuff. Like seriously, these are great players. Anyway, so the actual decks and the lineup in question. So I'm just going to start off by sort of like showing you guys what we ended up going with, and then kind of like explaining why. So this is the first deck. This is Brown Swain, fairly somewhat standard version, kind of like a lot more anti-aggro with Icefield Archer at a 3 of and Arachnoid Sentry as a 3 of. So that's the Brown Swain deck. Then we've got our Karma Ezreal deck named Mav is a Genius. I'll talk later about why it's called that. But this is a very bizarre form of Karma Ezreal. This is like heavily teched against aggro. We are running no Shadow Assassins. I almost cut a Will of Ionia, but just last minute added the third one back. And we're running like 2 Deep Meditation, 1 Yone, 1 Vi, 2 Gotchas, 2 Denies, 1 Deny being kind of more standard, and even a Key Guardian. So this is an absolutely strange Ezreal Karma list that we'll have to explain exactly about later. And the strangest list of them all, my own personal creation entitled The Funk. And this is weird. It's a deep deck that doesn't run Jettison, doesn't run Nautilus, and doesn't run Abyssal Eye. This is a very strange concept. So we're gonna talk. Let's break down this lineup, and let's break down the kind of like these deck choices and what the idea is. So you'll notice that all 3 of these decks are heavily tailored against aggro. I've built all 3 of these decks basically like as anti-aggro as I can, while making sure that each of them has a nice way to like power out the top end to beat some like control mirrors. Like I was anticipating some amounts of like deep decks, some amount of like Brown Swain, some amount of even some versions of like Brown Manivia. I'm actually surprised I didn't see a single Brown Manivia. I don't think it's a great deck. But basically we are hard teched against aggro while still maintaining the ability to break down control decks. So the entire lineup is built around our single ban, which is Karma Ezreal. So in Conquest, you get this idea of a ban, and you should kind of build your entire lineup around that ban, right? So we're always with this lineup ban on Karma Ezreal, and this is why we're able to make things like the Karma Ezreal deck that's, you know, we're not running this Karma Ezreal deck could not win mirrors. This would be terrible in the mirror. We're running 2 Karmas. We're running cards like Yone, 0 Shadow Assassins. Again, it's hard to explain how insane that is. Shadow Assassin is absolutely ridiculous value in the mirror. Like when 2 Karma Ezreal players are playing the mirror at a high level, like every Shadow Assassin you play gives you such a crazy advantage. But because we know we're always banning Karma Ezreal, we can bring a lot of decks that would otherwise be pretty unfavored against it, like Deep, like a very aggro tech version of Karma Ezreal, and like Swain Brown, which is actually not insanely unfavored against Karma Ezreal if you play it really well. So the reason we're able to build our 3 decks like this is because of the Karma Ezreal ban. Now, what makes it so that we want to ban Karma Ezreal? Well, Karma Ezreal represents, to put it simply, sort of the most unique and somewhat oppressive play pattern of any deck in the meta. And this has actually like been true for a long time with Ionia. Almost always the tournament meta for Runeterra has just been like ban Ionia. This is mostly due to like Will of Ionia. It depends like meta to meta. Here, you know, I'll mention it's funny. I was thinking about cutting down copies of Will of Ionia, even given that. But that's the biggest reason is just because Ionia has the most unique combo play pattern, and there's not really other decks that can really play combo, right? For the most part, you know, stuff like Shadow Isles is kind of like the only region that can properly, reliably play control. And Ionia is the only region that can really properly play combo. I actually talked a little bit about this in my like game design talk series. And you guys, if you've watched that, I don't expect a ton of you guys to have watched that. It's like 6 hours long. But if you've watched that, you actually know exactly like what the design flaws there, because Ionia and Shadow Isles have access to some tools that other regions just don't. And that's why like these are the 2 regions that are just kind of like the most unique. So we can build a lineup that would normally lose to Ionia. Ionia represents kind of like, you know, the combo. So we basically build a very control-heavy lineup. Realm Omegalul is effectively a mid-range / control deck. It's a deck that's hard to categorize. You know, we've got our Karma Ezreal deck, which, you know, Karma Ezreal is meant to be a combo deck, but we've stripped it of almost as many combo elements as we could to make it more of a control deck. We're just trying to focus on staying alive. And you can even cut down on Karmas. You know, we could run like 3 Ezreal, 3 Vi. You know, that could have made sense as well. So that's like a combo deck that's leaning towards control. And then we've got the Funk, which is, again, it's a control deck that's like just making sure that we survive against aggro. This is actually a control deck that's leaning out of combo, because the whole Atrocity combo is kind of like how this deck wins. Now I'm going to go ahead and sort of, to better explain exactly like what I mean, because some of these terms might not be defined very well, I'm just going to go ahead and pull up my site, because I currently have a little bit of an infographic here that can be a little bit helpful with descriptive terms. So combo is just like the idea of sort of like they focus on like punch down instead of survivability. But there's kind of a spectrum between combo and control. So if you add more survivability and add less punch through, then you become more of a control deck and less of a combo deck, right? Control just kind of wants to like stay alive, outgrind, outvalue. So because Ionia, you know, there's a lot of different ways to play aggro. You can play with Noxus, you can play with, you know, Demacia. Depending on the build, Tempo Sejuani could be considered aggro or maybe a bit towards mid-range. And there are even multiple ways of playing control right now, because not only is like Shadow Isles control, but Braum Swain ends up being a fairly solid control-ish deck, which is pretty unique. But it's really hard to play combo without Ionia. And you can look at that. If we scroll up here, you know, check this out, where we see decks by type. Heimer Vi is combo. Karma Ezreal is combo. Ezreal TF is kind of like the one way to play a combo deck without Ionia, but I didn't expect anyone to bring it. And Deep is, I have it here listed as combo. To be perfectly honest, this is a bit outdated. I think the next time I update for Meta Mondays, I'll say this is a control deck. Deep is sort of like between, but for the most part, it does have some tendencies of both. I think it's a little bit more of a control deck. So now we've got this idea of combo, which sort of can only be done by Ionia, and combo beats control. So because we have this portion of the triangle, this entire area of the triangle can really only be done by one color, it's very simple then. We ban that color and then run all of our lineup being control, right? We bring 3 control decks. So this is the simple strategy in a nutshell, right? We identify which of these 3 points in the triangle is currently most represented by a single color. We ban that color, and then we make all 3 decks this other point in the triangle, because then we're only going to be against either some sorts of mirrors or aggro in this case, which control is favored against, right? So because of that, we have our general strategy here. Now, this can sometimes be referred to as like a target strategy. We are targeting aggro. And I've actually made like a couple of videos about this, talking about like targeting, and I don't like that word, and I think everyone kind of like uses it wrong. So what targeting means to a lot of people is in the idea of conquest, you know, you have to win with all your decks, right? So you've got, you know, deck. You've got like deck A, deck B, and deck C. And they're going to ban one. So your B plays until it wins and gets this like green check mark. And then your C plays until it wins and gets the green check mark. If you lose, you play again. So it's a format that is all about weakest link. So what that means is some people do this strategy called targeting in tournaments, wherein you build an entire lineup. Around trying to make sure that all of your decks, so it's like you look at, you know, your opponent is on X, Y, and Z, and you're thinking to yourself, man, okay, I think everyone's going to bring Z, so all I have to do is make all 3 of these decks favorable against Z, and then I can't lose. Because as long as Z can't win, I can auto lose to these 2 decks, I can auto lose to these, and I will always win as long as Z can't win. That's what people, I think, mean when they say targeting. I think that's like basically not what targeting is at all. I would use the word in a completely different way. So the idea here is that would be like hard targeting, which I think can very rarely be a concept in certain tournament strategies, mostly like sort of like unsolved metagames, reasonably speaking. How I see targeting is more like the idea of what people would say soft targeting. It's not really about going all in on it. It's just about engineering a slight mathematical boost. So you've got A, B, C against decks X, Y, Z. Okay? So you look at your matchup matrices for deck X, and you realize, okay, my A is 55% against X, my B is 65, and my C is 60%. And this is the matrix for X. So what that means is suddenly I'm thinking to myself, okay, and by the way, this is kind of like a boring tangent. We're doing like math stuff. I'll talk a lot more about individual card choices later, and that'll actually be a lot more interesting. You can skip this part. Anyway, sorry. But so here's the idea. So what this says is like, okay, deck X is reasonably expected, and our deck A, B, and C are all favored to it. So what that means is boosting the win rate of these decks will all sort of punish X. So we might make a tech to take this 55 and add in like +5 win percentage, right? We should tech slightly harder against things that we're already favored against. Or we can look at, let's say we've got a matchup matrix for, you know, deck Y over here. And let's say our A is like 45% into Y, our B is like 35% into Y, and our C is like 50% into Y. So we're pretty negative there. Y is pretty bad for us. Well, that's okay, because Conquest is a format about weakest link. It is actually okay for all of our decks to be unfavored against one matchup, especially because of the ban. We can always just ban out Y, right? So we, because of Conquest, don't really want to focus on improving these. We either want to ban it, or in some situations, just concede that the opponent has a slightly favorable chance of getting one win. But where it really matters is like when you have a matchup matrix that's going to be along the lines of like, you know, let's say the third one is is Z, and let's say that there's like, you know, a 45, a 60, and another 60. You know, we can look at this and we can be like, wow, we get so much value from increasing the percent win rate on the 45, right? Because these are both 60s. So the reason why this works is really, really simple. Super, super simple. And it's just because when a deck loses, it has to play again, which means that you just get a slight percentage mathematical edge every time your decks have strong matchups against opponents' decks that you expect them to bring. You want your decks, basically, here's how Conquest works. You want your decks to have similar offensive matchups, okay? So you want your offensive matchups to be similar. Offensive, so like you beat the same decks, but the sort of defensive matchups, the matchups where you're losing, it's okay to lose, right? So what you want in Conquest is you want a lineup that is sort of homogenized, right? If that makes sense. So for example, look at the triangle. We want to bring 3 control decks because then we just happen to get mathematical percentage increase on the aggro, because when we beat an aggro, it has to play again and our other decks are slightly favored. So it's just about these small percentage increases of the entire set. So we want to consolidate, right? Make sure that our lineup is cohesive. We want to bring, like, not necessarily exactly, but like a decent way of explaining this concept is it can be a good idea to bring something like 3 aggro decks, or something like 3 combo decks, or something like 3 control decks. Again, not necessarily exactly, but you want to bring 3 decks that are going to have similar matchup tables. Find something that it has like a bannable weak point, and then, you know, make sure that you are teched enough against either aggro or control, because, you know, we ban combo, but we might see aggro, we might see control mirrors, and that's kind of where the meta read comes in. Like, how many people are expected to bring aggro, how many people are expected to bring control. So this is like the fundamental concept of designing a lineup. Now, you'll see a lot of weird deck building choices in response to this. Like, for example, the fact that we're not running Nautilus in this deck is entirely because of that, because we're hard teched against aggro, and I actually have a bit of a hot take, which is that I don't think Nautilus is that good in the control mirror at all, actually. I think Nautilus is just a bait card, and it's bad, and it always has been bad, but we'll see. More on that later. You see, you know, our other decks, Braum is also heavily teched against aggro. Iceveil Archer, 3 Iceveil Archer, 3 Arachnoid Sentry. We're just slowing down aggression, right? And then, of course, the Karma Ezreal does some insane stuff to get outside of aggro. Now, we've entitled Mav as a genius, and the reason for that is because we've actually omega teched this deck against aggro, more so than the others. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Because, and this is Mav's idea, but the reason for that is pretty simple. Because Karma, a lot of other people are going to be doing sort of this same strategy we're doing, right? Because a lot of people ban Karma Ezreal, because it's just kind of like the most exploitable thing to ban, or Heimervi. It's like Ionia, PNZ is kind of the ban, right? So the idea is only like an all aggro lineup could possibly not ban Karma Ezreal. That's the only way our Karma Ezreal is ever getting played, because it's always going to get banned otherwise. So we want to absolutely tech this for aggro in every possible way, because Karma Ezreal will always get banned if the opponent's not running like a double or triple aggro lineup. So we've gone super, super far in the tech. I've brought back like the one of Yone. That did big things. We're down to like 2 Static Shocks. You know, we're in Key Guardian, Triple Eye, Triple Claws, Triple Rummage, and Triple Trump Lump. These are like just making sure we're stabilizing early. And even the 2 Deny. Now, this seems kind of weird because in most metas, Deny is actually bad against aggro and good against like these kind of slower combo mirrors or like control decks sometimes. But in this meta, Deny is actually really good against aggro. It's how you stop harrowing, and it's how you can stop Relentless Pursuit sometimes in the Scout deck as well. So Deny is really sweet, right? And we actually got to play a lot in this tournament with Karma Ezreal. We got to play with this deck a ton, because a lot of these opponents were bringing aggro out the ass, and they couldn't ban Karma Ezreal because they're bringing this aggro lineup. That is basically, think about it like this, that's their strategy. That's a target. And some of these players did this, which is bringing a triple aggro lineup, and instead of banning Karma Ezreal, they target it, right? Because Karma Ezreal's combo, and aggro beats combo, right? And our Karma Ezreal deck got to play 3 times because of that, because people were trying to target it instead of banning it. But because we preemptively made our deck absolutely teched out the ass against aggro, it becomes a lot less targetable. And that's kind of like that's the most important thing about where our lineups ended up. So now let's talk about some of the specific individual choices, because there's still a little bit to cover in terms of like, you know, those options. Yone, here, let me go ahead and I have to change back to the screen. Yep, there we go. Yone is really good. Of course, in the current meta, it's great against like Genevieve. It's great against Harrowing. So it easily earns like the 1-of slot here. Karma was still in the deck. I actually expected more control in this tournament. I saw mostly aggro, and we're teched for aggro, so that's fine. But I did still have to respect a lot of like control decks or control mirrors. So what that means is we didn't end up cutting the Karmas. Now, these Karmas didn't really do anything for me in this tournament just because it was all aggro, but we do have to have a bit of a balance and make sure that we're good against the control decks as well, right? So we ended up still, keeping in the Karmas, but we're out of cards like Static Shock, and we have like the super, super aggressive early cards. Like Karma Ezreal really doesn't run cards like 3 Trump Pump and 3 Rummage anymore. This is like sort of like very old school. But Trump Wump has a really great stat line in the meta right now. It has a stat line that is amazing against Island Navigator on turn 4. Absolutely ridiculous stat exchange. And against Basilisk Rider on turn 4, you're losing a bit of health, but they lose the Basilisk Rider, which is super important. So Trump Wump is pretty good stat line for this meta. I also really like Concussive Palm in this meta. Card's absolutely insane when you're checking against aggro. I mentioned earlier that I was thinking about cutting 1 Will of Ionia, and it was in favor of Concussive Palm. I was going to go 3 Palm, 2 Will, and that's how crazy Palm is right now, especially when you're planning against the aggro matchup. There's so many attacks that you just absolutely shut down with Palm. Like, no question about that. Absolutely ridiculous card. Okay, so that's kind of this deck in a nutshell, and that explains the 1 Vi and why we're not running the 3 Deep Meditation. Trying to not be greedy. Braum, this is probably like the most straightforward deck. At this point in time, it just comes down to color management, because in Runeterra tournaments, you need to use like 6 different colors, which means like, we will have to make some slightly awkward concessions, like our deep deck, which is like a little weird just because we couldn't really use a second color. But we just want to make sure that our entire lineup is geared very well towards aggro. This deck in particular is the best one. Aggro lineups have to ban this deck, and they always did. This is the deck I got to play the least in the entire tournament. We saw a ton of aggro. More than anticipated, but still in the anticipated range. And honestly, it's pretty safe to say that this tournament was won in the deck builder. Like, really, like I mentioned at the start. So we've got another aggro deck, anti-aggro deck that has its like sort of very, very punchy and very narrow game enter, just so we can beat control mirrors. Leviathan does come in handy there for a lot of those reasons. And then lastly, we've got this deck, which is like, again, the hottest take here. Now, actually, I will say, unrelated to this tournament lineup, I think that Jettison is a straight up bad card, and I think that Fading Memories is just a better version of Jettison. This is something that if you watch this channel, you might actually remember. I said this at the start of Bilgewater, like before we actually got the expansion, like when the cards were being revealed. I said I don't like Jettison as a card. My opinion on it actually hasn't changed that entire time. I've never liked this card. You guys might have seen me like play deep decks like a little bit. I haven't played a ton of this archetype. I've never liked Jettison. I've tried it a few times, but Fading Memories is just a better card to me, straight up. What Fading Memories does for this deck, so if you want to use it on a Dreg Dredgers, it's like the same as Jettison, right? If you use it on, like, if you're against an aggro matchup, you can use it on Thorny Toad or Dead Bloom Wanderer, make an opponent's attack really awkward. You can use it on Jaw Hunters. This is amazing, always. Jaw Hunters is a nuts card, and what this deck just wants more of, period. So sometimes when you don't want to use it as a toss card, you can use it on Jaw Hunters. It's a challenger, so the ephemeral doesn't matter, right? You can use it on like Devour of the Depths in the late game. Sometimes you can use it on opponent's units. It's just a better Jettison. Like, trust me, if you're a deep player, try out Fading Memories instead of Jettison, play it for 5 games, and I know you'll come around to it. So I just like Fading Memories better than Jettison. Now, I will say, cutting Nautilus and cutting Abyssal Eye, that's a bit more of a hot take. And that partly was just because of like where the tournament lineup was at. But I do actually want to mess around with deep versions that don't run Nautilus, because I do think Nautilus is kind of a bad card. Again, that's something I said before Bilgewater got released, when it was revealed, and my opinion on that hasn't really changed. I don't think Nautilus is a very good card. I think that deep is an archetype that is sort of like fallen into this weird position of being like role played. Like, a lot of people run it as a combo deck, when I think it really just wants to be a form of like Shadow Isles plus X control. The more sea monsters you add, the worse the deck gets. You just want these to be sort of like supplemental finishers that are going to enable your win condition against like the slower matchups. That being said, I can't say that 0 Nautilus is correct. Maybe it's 1 or 2 Nautilus. Maybe it's like 2 Abyssal Eyes. I can't necessarily comment on the ratios with certainty, but all I can say is I do think that those cards are overrated and being ran at too high of ratios, okay? That's my take here. But yeah, we're running 2 Ruinations. This is an amazing counter against Demacia because they just can't really play around it. So Demacia aggro, that's all aggro. As well as Darrowing because they have to use Harrowing, and Ruination is a great counter to Harrowing as well, right? In the stead of Nautilus, we're running Thresh, which looks like a hot take, right? Because it's like, Thresh is just pulling out Maokai. What the hell is that? Well, Thresh isn't really here for the level up or the pull. And a control mirror pulling out Maokai is actually really important because this is how we win. But also, in the aggro matchup, having a 5-mana 3/6 challenger is just all you could possibly ever want. That's amazing. That's super good. We don't really need to play him for like the extra effect. That doesn't really end up mattering too much. Okay, we did run 1 Shipwreck Hoarder, and this was kind of for the sake of like the mirror match. Again, we were anticipating some more control-y stuff. Didn't end up coming into play big here. And we're on 3 Missed Calls as well. I think a really huge part of deck building this deck, my general thesis for how I would construct a deep deck, number 1 rule, your cards need to be good across different matchups. That's part of the reason I don't like Jettison. Fading Memories is flexible. Against aggro, it's what you want. Against control, it's what you want. Missed Call is flexible. Against aggro, it's like a second Wanderer, second Jaw Hunters. It's what you want, right? And against control, I can use it on a Maokai. I can use it on a Thresh. It's flexible. So again, this is my number 1 rule of deep. You do not want cards that... You don't want too many cards that can only do one thing. And this is the golden rule here. This is part of the reason I don't like Nautilus. Because I look at this card, Vengeance, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, in the deep mirror, a Vengeance is a Nautilus. Because they just trade even. They play Nautilus, I Vengeance it. That's an even trade. Perfectly fine. But in an aggro mirror, I would... Or, sorry, not mirror, but an aggro matchup, I would much, 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 much rather have Vengeance than a Nautilus. Like, not even close. In this meta in particular, some metas, Vengeance isn't great against aggro, but against, like, Darrowing, Vengeance is great. Against Scouts, it can be pretty good against Genevieve. It's an actual alive card, right? So, it looks kind of weird, but Vengeance is sort of just, like, that flexible card, right? And you look at all these cards, and you can see, like, almost all of them are hitting different matchups, right? Like even Ruination. This can be useful in many different matchups, right? Even Grasp. In the deep mirror, I can Grasp like an Abyssal Eye. That's perfectly fine, right? Like there's nothing wrong with that. I will get value out of this card. Or against aggro, I'll get value out of it. And this is the big problem. This is the single biggest thing I don't like about most deep versions. Is that they're kind of role-playing. They're like, oh, I'm going to get my sea monsters big, and I'm going to end the game with my big sea monsters. And again, I can't promise 0 Nautilus, 0 Abyssal Eye is correct, but I think for the most part, you definitely want your cards to be dual purpose. You need your cards to hit different modes, right? Missed Call, I was running, you know, Rattling Bones, he said to me, Swimmy, you're going to want 3 Missed Call in this list. And I, before testing it, I was like, no way, I can't do 3. I can't do 3. I can do 2. And I was like firm about this. And I played a bunch, and eventually I was like, shit, man, you're right. I have to put it at 3 Missed Call. Rattling Bones, super smart guy, one of the prep guys I mentioned earlier. So, yeah, again, it's just so incredibly integral to have these cards that can be sort of multi-purposed, right? Even Hired Gun sort of looks like kind of trolly, but obviously it's great against aggro. Against like the deep mirror or control, it can help my Toad Suicide, and that's super important because when you draw Toad in a slower matchup, it kind of never dies because they don't attack into you. They're never really going to, and then it's bricked. But Hired Gun can allow my Toad to just kill itself and get me the toss. Super valuable. Okay, so that's the general idea of this deck, and I might be over the next couple of days on stream actually playing more around with this concept and trying to find what I would consider to be a good ladder version. I will say, you know, even though I don't like Jettison, and I do think that stuff like Abyssal Eye and Nautilus is overrepresented, this is not a made-for-ladder deck. Keep that in mind, right? There's a couple different things going on here. But anyway, that's the lineup as a whole, guys. I really wanted to talk about that because I know some of these decks look weird. I know it looks like super weird, some of these choices, but tournament lineup design is super interesting, especially like when you get into it. There's so many cool things you can do. I love the tournament format in Runeterra. The Conquest is good, and the 6 different colors. You have to use different colors. There's so many crazy innovative ways to do it. Casanova brought Swain Yasuo. Dog brought Braum Lux. right? We saw some weird stuff in this tournament, and I brought weird stuff. You have to bring weird stuff. The rules so incentivize that, and it's so refreshing compared to ladder. So like, I mean, if this sounds interesting even at all, I'd really recommend joining some of these like kind of like weekly community open tournaments. They're pretty casual, like no major prize pool. Really check them out. I'll put in the pinned comment an additional link to some of these like weekly just community tournaments that you can just sign up for and play. You don't need, you know, there's no entry price or anything like that. You can just play, try out some of these strategies, and unlike ladder, you just get so rewarded for being creative and innovative, right? Maybe you do a little bit on ladder, but it's like, it's a lot more about just kind of like, you know, slamming net decks and not sucking with them, honestly. So that's just kind of my take. I really wanted to kind of like explain this to you guys, because I know a lot of people do know that tournament decks need to be built different from ladder decks, because you've all heard that, but might not understand why or what goes into that. Anyway, that's it for this video. Yeah, that's all I got. I'll see you guys next time.